Hey everyone, we continue our journey of ranking all Spider-Man games with some assistance from my Stasocritic system, the details of which you can find in the pinned comment. The whole period between 1982 and 1996 wasn't the greatest for Spider-Man video games. There's 23 entries in our rankings, with only one game that can be called good, 2 are pretty nice, a couple average, and the rest ranges from to pretty bad. Between 1996 and 2000, there hasn't been a single Spider-Man video game released. No wonder why, honestly. But in the year 2000, something would change. Spider-Man games would become big again, with almost twice the existing amount made in the following decade. The movie trilogy, of course, played a big role, but also, quite frankly, the overall increased quality of the games has also helped the resurgence quite a bit. So let's see how the Spider-Man titles of the early 2000s have changed the playing field. Developed by Neversoft, this title was originally released for PlayStation and Nintendo 64, and then later ported with updated graphics to Dreamcast and PC. Both versions are part of the same entry because, with the exception of better faces, the Dreamcast and PC versions don't outright improve the game aesthetically as much as they'll make it look on a higher resolution like you would have imagined the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 versions to look like. This is the very first 3D Spider-Man game, but what really separates it from pretty much absolutely every other Spider-Man title that came before it, with the exception of Maximum Carnage, which was a solid adaptation, is the desire to feel authentic. On a basic level, this means that you don't fight swarms of rats or bats. You don't need to use a crowbar to open a door, spiders don't suddenly fall from trees to kill you. In other words, there is no random bullshit. But on a deeper level, it's how the game swims in Spider-Man's colorful comic book campiness, and tries to do everything in its power to transmit that camp through our monitors. And I'm not talking just about the color palette or the scriptwriting style with a bunch of memetic gold in it.
Here it is, the records room.
Surf the web, surf the web.
Shut up, Brock, we don't have time.
But also things like the reimagining of the classic Spider-Man theme song you heard in the beginning of the video, a bunch of costumes you can unlock and use whenever and however you'd like, an advanced comic book gallery which not only shows the collectible covers you found in the levels, but also has information about why that issue was important, the voice actors from various Spider-Man TV shows, cameos from other Marvel heroes like Daredevil and the Punisher, and Stan Lee himself not only narrating the character encyclopedia, but also the story itself, sometimes openly lampshading the situations we're in.
Ah, the cliché seedy waterfront warehouse. Although, I'm guessing that this particular warehouse has a bit more in store for the webhead than even he can imagine.
I first learned about Spider-Man thanks to the 1994 TV show, which Where I Lived aired somewhere around the year 1999-2000, and he quickly became my favorite superhero. The 2001 PC port was the first Spider-Man game I played. We don't count the Atari one because at the time I didn't know the character, and I was instantly hooked because of how it felt so familiar. Like this is everything I would have expected from a Spider-Man game. So if anything, this title deserves praise just because of how much it cares about the license it is based on. But more than that, it's simply a good game. And look, I'm not saying it is perfect, the core mechanics are lacking in some significant ways. There is no way to rotate the camera, no lock-on feature outside of targeting mode, web swinging is on rails after getting activated and doesn't work unless you're close enough to stickable surfaces, there is no straightforward way to dodge or block, or to properly select which enemy you're trying to target with the webs in the midst of battle. All these are indeed problems, and if you try to play the game's challenge modes, they are really evident. Honestly, I wouldn't even bother with those fight arenas because of this. However, in the main campaign itself, you don't actually feel the issues because the whole game has been designed with these limitations in mind. For example, while you can't control the camera, most levels require attention only for whatever is in the 180 degrees view in front of you, be it outside in urban areas or inside. Interiors are also made in such a way that even big halls have this forward-facing progression. If you need to have a wider view of the area or be constantly locked onto somebody, the camera does that for you already. So very rarely do you have to actually turn the camera around yourself. Admittedly, in cases where you have to, like in a battle with Venom within a small alleyway, it can be annoying, but it's not a problem that's prevalent during the whole game. Speaking of Venom, his position when outside your screen is not shown with a red arrow like with every other enemy, which is a very nice in-game way of showing how he avoids spider sense. All other enemies have an arrow pointing towards them when they're outside of the screen, and their attack and shooting patterns are slow enough that you don't feel overwhelmed. It helps that it's enough to use only 1 or 2 3-hit combos to deal with most of the mooks, or just whip them up quickly. The latter feels especially satisfying in the game's stealth sections, which are surprisingly not horrible as you would usually expect from such action-adventure games that are not built for stealth at all. The rules and situations encountered are very basic, but that's precisely why it doesn't feel annoying. Spidey also has some creative web-based moves in his arsenal. Only a couple, but enough to make it feel like his web powers matter. The only standard enemies that are a pain to defeat are the symbiotes, and that's on purpose, so you would have a power rush once you find some fire whip power-ups. Bosses are pretty varied, and while on one hand some can feel lacking basic requirements like wind-ups, for example when you're close to Venom he has a grab attack that's practically instant, at the same time this encourages you to find other tactics. This very same Venom is pretty susceptible to impact webs. Every boss has a particular weakness or strategy that will allow you to defeat them pretty efficiently. And while the level design of each particular mission may not be something amazing, it takes you over with the sheer variety of what you'll be doing. From the aforementioned stealth sections, to getting chased by a helicopter that's trying to blast you into smithereens, to surprisingly spacious and not horrible sewer levels, to survival fights on top of a subway train. Each level is pretty short, and as a whole it won't take you that long to beat the entire game, but also it's very replayable, especially with the new costumes that you unlock. What I appreciate is that if a costume unlock requires you to complete the game on hard difficulty, the game doesn't prevent you from using other extra costumes you have to do that, even the symbiote one with unlimited webbing. So it's up to you how you decide to tackle these challenges. And hey, maybe you would like to get the whole comic collection, and I'd say that most are hidden very reasonably, though there are some that require weird backtracking after specific moments that aren't intuitive and difficult to find without a guide, but there is not a lot of these examples. All this is wrapped in a story that's perhaps not particularly amazing, but it's funny enough and engaging, with tons of cute interactions between Spider-Man, his allies and enemies. The game is very tongue-in-cheek, but also wants to keep you immersed. As such, things like the fog you see below the buildings due to rendering limitations is actually an important plot point. This Spider-Man game is not without issues, but it clearly has a lot of care and attention to detail put into it. I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 78. It's a very good game, and indeed, a true classic that deserves to be remembered. While Neversoft was working on a Spider-Man game for consoles, Vicarious Visions was making one for Game Boy Color. And I really have to appreciate the quite successful attempt at making this little GPC game feel cinematic from the very first seconds. The intro is a pretty impressive mishmash of company logos and the game's main premise, which then transforms into a very atmospheric main menu screen. And while the narrative told here might not be as engaging or elaborate as in the console equivalent, clearly a lot of thought has gone into the title. but sadly it falters in terms of implementation. And while you might be engrossed at the beginning, the more you play, the more faults you encounter. The game actually has some similarities to the Amazing Spider-Man 2 for Game Boy, in that it's not a set of levels, but an interconnected world that even changes time of day as you progress through the story. There is a light RPG system with Spider-Man learning some new moves and improving attack and defense stats as you progress, a flawed but good enough to not lose all progress password system that not only saves your last story checkpoint, but also your last relevant level up or power up. Some parts of the controls can be a little clunky, like how to go from crawling one wall to the opposite one, but are generally speaking comfortable and responsive, which is a welcome sight for a Spider-Man platformer. I surprisingly like the decision to make shooting webs not an action where you have to hold A and B at the same time, but where you have to roll your finger from one button to another quickly. An unorthodox decision, but feels natural after a bit, especially considering you will need to use webs a lot against the quite basic enemies and bosses. Sadly, there is a catch, and that's level design. The issue with it is twofold. One, while the environments are impressively drawn, they also lack variety. And considering that Spider-Man is essentially a little side-scrolling open world, it can be very confusing to understand where you actually are. And the second issue that confounds it is the labyrinthine nature of the levels, not only of some more open-ended areas like the docks, but especially really closed spaces like the sewers. Unlike sewers from the console versions, these ones are cramped, difficult to navigate, and honestly are simply a pain. It doesn't help that the farther you progress, the more constantly respawning enemies are thrown at you, and that can get quite annoying. So all in all, this version of Spider-Man gets a Stasocritic rating of 54. It's not bad and certainly so much better than most of the other Spider-Man games out there. I like the direction, but your enjoyment will really depend on your frustration ceiling. The sequel to the console Spider-Man game was also developed by Vicarious Visions, and it was actually a PlayStation exclusive not released on any other platform. This is one of the reasons why I hadn't played it during my childhood despite really wanting to. We had only PC and didn't have any consoles beyond the old Atari 2600. And now I finally played it. And, well, most people say that Enter Electro is disappointing because it's more of the same. But to me that's always a weird argument because more of good is still good, right? The thing is, Enter Electro is a game that I really want to like, but every time I play it after a while I just have to stop because it becomes too frustrating. And then I sort of want to get back and continue, and after a while I remember why I stopped. I actually still haven't finished the game and probably won't. Enter Electro has a lot of really cool ideas, but these ideas don't fit the mechanics of the original, which do see some updates but are very similar still, and they also don't fit the platform, the stuff is too ambitious for it. For example, the game has many more open area levels, but these levels can be a bit confusing in terms of navigation because of the lackluster camera, barren in terms of life because PlayStation can't support more than several NPCs at once, and also very taxing on performance and therefore are quite laggy. A boss battle with Shocker requires to throw hanging crates on top of him. Great idea, but even with the added little lock-on functionality, it's very frustrating, nearly impossible to properly switch between the two targets. Boss battle with Hammerhead? Again, cool concept, but it requires a lot of camera movement because you need to avoid the dude running at you while also web yanking his weapon away from him. It's very unwieldy to actually try and do that properly. There is a little level that you can either complete through stealth or open action, and for stealth you need to stay on top of lampposts, like one would do in one of the modern games for example. But here getting on those lampposts might be tricky. A high-octane action level like the one where you need to stop a plane while preventing it from crashing into barrels and gates is a very cool idea, but again, the combined factors of poor performance because of too much stuff going on and therefore lagging input, no camera control while having to keep track of your surroundings, and lack of a snappy lock-on system make this cool, ambitious idea very frustrating to play. Combine this with factors that clearly show a lack of time to polish, like very weird-looking cutscenes, collectibles that are haphazardly put, not to mention that each is available only on specific difficulty levels, so you have to replay the game 4 times to get everything, music that's too generic and doesn't enhance the level atmosphere enough, a story that's... well, honestly, it's fine and enjoyable, but lacks the charm from the first game. Mainly because most of the time, Spider-Man doesn't get to interact with anyone but himself.
Quick, Spider Lad, you stop the plane and I'll get the bad guys. Oh wait, I don't have a sidekick.
And then there's elements that just don't get to shine at all. Stuff like new types of webs, ice and electric, are practically useless. In the original game, Fire Web provided a very easy way to defeat the symbiotes that were otherwise a pain. Here the ice webs are really no different from standard ones, and while electric webs are a bit more effective against robots, it's only a little in comparison to the normal webbing. So, Enter Electro gets a Stasicritic rating of 58. It's alright, it can definitely be enjoyed, but it cracks at the seams because of the game's ambition not meeting the platform requirements and the rushed development cycle the team seems to have had. Another handheld title developed by Vicarious Visions, and you can really see the roots coming from their first Game Boy outing. The mechanics and style of the game are very similar, only instead of it being an open world, everything is divided into levels. A little bit of an aside, whenever I really disagree with public consensus or a Metacritic score, it is usually because I think a game is better than what it gets credit for. There are times though when a game is really well received, for example Mysterio's Menace has a Metacritic score of 84, and my opinion is pretty much diametrically opposing that. Look, the game is not without its merits. For example, the controls are amazing, really snappy and precise. It also looks very good on a Game Boy Advance screen in particular. I have to specify this because the style of graphics is really messy if you look at it in a pixel-perfect way on modern LCD monitors. Maybe these two aspects were enough for people to find enjoyment of the game back in those days. It's not like there were any other alternatives on Game Boy Advance for Spider-Man fans. But the game is full of issues. The first big one being the confusing, labyrinthine design of the levels that's really not enjoyable, and the second main one being the design of enemies, both standard ones and bosses. There is a lot of instant and fast attacks without any sort of wind-ups, enemy collision with you feels pixel perfect, so even a little touch is enough to damage you, while your attacks on the other hand can easily miss because of that. There is a spider sense mechanic that is supposed to warn you of incoming threats, but it all happens so fast that there is absolutely no way you will have time to react. It makes the game feel really frustrating and unfair. And that is if we don't mention things like a story that literally doesn't matter and other smaller flaws. Mysterio's Menace gets a Stasicritic rating of 39. There might be some that can find enjoyment in it even now, but for me personally, it is a disappointing experience. The sequel to the previous Game Boy Color title was made by Chorus Games, and honestly, I was very pleasantly surprised by it. The game took the already nice core mechanics of the previous game, polished them up a bit more, and then streamlined everything else to deliver an experience that is perhaps not the most ambitious one, but it's enjoyable. Every level has a unique style to them. In terms of level design, they're nothing amazing, but are fine, with a clear goal and reasonable way to progress with some alternate paths and secrets. Enemies? Again, basic, but it chooses a particular strategy against you, so in the end, enjoyable. Every boss has essentially a single pattern and therefore a single strategy against them. Once you figure it out, it's a matter of using that strategy over and over again until you defeat them. Again, nothing special, but also these boss battles are short enough so it doesn't get super annoying, and certainly more varied than the bosses from the previous game. Everything that would somehow complicate the experience was removed. No RPG system, no semi-open world, everything is level-based, and if you stay still for a while, Spider Sense will tell you where to go. Story? Straightforward. The Sinister Six captured Aunt May, you're out to find her as you deal with them one by one. Nothing fancy, but it's clear and it works. And quite honestly, the game looks amazing for a Game Boy Color title. The art style really elevates every level, the animations are really smooth while not hindering the snappiness of the gameplay. I have never seen the Sinister Six in any of the lists of great-looking Game Boy Color games, but it definitely should be there. Though I can't help but mention that I find it both cringy and impressive that the game managed to find a way to shove in female enemies with visible huge breasts and cleavage into the small 160 by 144 resolution of the Game Boy Color. I mean, no comment there. Still, that aside, the Sinister Six gets a Stasocritic rating of 65. For me, it was a one-and-done type of game, but I don't regret my time with it. It's fun, it's not long, it's worth checking out if you're into some nice Spider-Man platforming action. And this is it for this video. Spider-Man started the 2000s with a bang. At least comparatively speaking. Mysterio's Menace disappointment aside, the worst Spider-Man games seen these years are just alright games that fans can still reasonably enjoy. That is impressive, especially when we combine it with the fact that there was also a really good Spider-Man game that deserves to be called a classic. Even though it is not without flaws, it is greatly enjoyable because of how it has captured the spirit of the comics and the character. I stopped at 2001 because I figured 2002 deserves its own chapter, as at that point the games are going to become not only licensed comic and animated show properties, but licensed movie ones as well.